For Americans visiting Britain, the garden arrives as a pleasant surprise followed immediately by a quiet confusion. You step through the back door of a terraced house in Leeds or Bristol and find a small enclosed rectangle of grass and paving, perhaps 8 meters long and 4 meters wide, bounded on every side by fences and the rear walls of neighboring properties. There is a patio with chairs, a patch of lawn, some containers with plants along the fence. It is private and genuinely pleasant and entirely manageable, and then you try to understand where the yard is, where the space is, where the American idea of outdoor space has gone. And you realize it was never here. This is all there is. This small enclosed rectangle behind a terraced house is the British garden, and for the family that lives here, it is enough. British people visiting America experience the outdoor space the way they experience the bedroom and the bathroom, as a thing that should not be possible at the price of a normal house. A suburban home outside Columbus or Raleigh sits on a lot of perhaps 700 to 1,000 square meters. The house occupies perhaps a third of it. What remains is split between a front lawn that runs open and uninterrupted to the pavement and a backyard that extends far enough from the rear of the house that a child could kick a ball without hitting anything. There are trees mature enough to provide real shade. There is a deck or a patio large enough to seat 12 people. There is often a garage down one side and still enough space beside it for a trampoline and a storage shed. The outdoor space is not an afterthought of the house. It is part of the house, an extension of the living area into the open air. Same modern world, same desire for privacy and outdoor space, and somewhere to sit in the sun. Yet the average private garden attached to a British home measures around 190 square meters when it exists at all. Millions of British homes, particularly flats and newer terraced properties, have no private outdoor space whatsoever. The average American residential lot measures around 700 to 1,000 square meters, of which a substantial portion is usable outdoor space. The American yard is not simply larger, it occupies a different category of experience. It is outdoor space that can be used rather than outdoor space that can be stood in. How did two wealthy modern nations arrive at such completely different answers to the same question of how much space a family should have outside their front and back door? The answer, as with so much else about British housing, begins in the medieval period and the legal structures that outlasted it by centuries. In medieval England, land was not simply space, it was a legal instrument. The system of burgage plots that shaped British town centres from the 12th century onward allocated each household a strip of land running back from the street frontage. These strips were narrow at the front, typically 12 to 18 feet wide, because street frontage was where commercial value lay, where trade happened, where visibility mattered. The depth of the plot behind the house varied, but the pattern it established was consistent. A long, narrow strip, a house at the front facing the street, a yard behind the house for animals, storage, and the practical requirements of daily life. A small enclosed space understood as a working area rather than a leisure space. As British towns grew through the Tudor and Stuart periods and the pressure on urban land intensified, these plots were subdivided further. Rear yards shrank. In the densest neighborhoods of London and the northern industrial cities, the space behind the house was not a garden at all. It was a shared court containing a pump, a privy, and enough room to hang washing. Privacy was not the expectation. Functionality was. The outdoor space behind a British urban house was defined by what it needed to contain rather than by any aspiration about what it might offer. The Industrial Revolution completed this compression. When the great terraced housing programs of the 19th century transformed British cities to house the factory workforce, the rear yard was included as a functional minimum rather than a generous provision. A standard working-class terrace in Manchester or Birmingham or Liverpool offered a rear yard of perhaps 20 to 30 square meters, enough for a privy, later replaced by an indoor toilet, a coal store, and a washing line. The concept of this space as a garden, as a place for growing things and sitting in the sun and experiencing the outdoors from the privacy of your own property, developed slowly and unevenly. It was a middle-class aspiration that filtered downward through the housing stock across generations, rather than a right built into working-class housing from the beginning. The semi-detached suburbs that spread around British cities in the interwar years of the 1920s and 1930s represented the high point of British garden provision for ordinary families. The suburban semi-detached house, built during this period, typically offered a front garden of perhaps 20 to 30 square meters, sufficient for a low boundary wall and some planting, and a rear garden of perhaps 100 to 150 square meters, large enough for a lawn, some beds, and a vegetable patch if the occupant wanted. These gardens were understood as a serious amenity. The garden suburb ideal that influenced British planning during this period placed outdoor space at the heart of what good housing should provide. It was a vision of the city giving way to the country at the edges, of ordinary families having access to the kind of space that had previously been available only to those wealthy enough to afford a house with grounds. That vision did not survive the pressures that followed the Second World War unchanged. The Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, which introduced the Green Belt and transformed British land use policy, also reinforced the idea that urban land was too valuable to use generously. Inside the Green Belt, every plot was worth more than the plot outside it. Developers working within the constraint of protected land learned to maximize the number of units they could fit onto whatever land received planning permission. Garden sizes fell as unit numbers rose. The 150 square meter rear garden of the 1930s semi became the 80 square meter rear garden of the 1960s council house, became the 50 square meter rear garden of the 1990s. Private new build became, in the new builds of the 21st century, something that can sometimes be measured in single figures, a space barely large enough for a table, and 2 chairs that planning policy designates as a private amenity space, and estate agents describe as a courtyard garden. A 2018 study by the Royal Horticultural Society found that Britain had lost around 30,000 acres of garden to development in the preceding decade alone. Front gardens in particular had been overwhelmingly converted to hard standing for cars. Streets that had once had continuous planting at their edges became continuous concrete. The garden that British families in the 1930s had received as a standard provision of decent housing had become, in many newer developments, a legal formality rather than a genuine amenity. Across the Atlantic, the outdoor space of the American home was being shaped by a completely different set of forces, producing a completely different outcome. The Federal Housing Administration standards established in 1934 and refined through the post-war years included minimum lot size requirements as well as minimum housing standards. A house eligible for a federally backed mortgage had to sit on a lot of sufficient size to meet local zoning requirements, and local zoning requirements, upheld by the Supreme Court in the 1926 Village of Euclid case, specified minimum lot sizes that locked generous outdoor space into the suburban model as a legal requirement rather than a developer's choice. In many American suburban jurisdictions, a residential lot could not legally be smaller than 600 or 700 square meters. In wealthier suburbs, the minimums were far higher, an acre, 2 acres. The law wrote outdoor space into the American suburb with the same certainty that it wrote out density in apartments and anything that might have allowed people to live closer together and use less land per family. The GI Bill of 1944 and the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 made the land available to fulfill these requirements. Cheap agricultural land made accessible by new roads and made financeable by government-backed mortgages became the raw material for millions of suburban lots, sized generously enough to satisfy zoning minimums and still leave room for a yard that felt like space rather than a legal afterthought. By 1960, the American suburban backyard had become a cultural institution, the space where children spent their summers, where the family gathered for the cookout, where the lawn was cut on Saturday morning with a pride that was only partly about the grass. The backyard was not just outdoor space, it was an extension of the American idea that a man's home was his private domain, and the land around it was the physical proof of that privacy. The front yard developed differently but with equal consequence. American zoning codes required setbacks from the street. A house had to be built a certain distance back from the pavement, typically 20 to 30 feet in suburban jurisdictions. This mandatory distance produced the American front lawn, an expanse of grass that runs from the house to the road without interruption, without fencing, without any boundary that might separate the private space of the homeowner from the public space of the street. The open front lawn became a characteristic feature of American suburban life, simultaneously a marker of prosperity and a contribution to the visual openness of the neighborhood. Fencing the front yard was, in many HOA-governed communities, actually prohibited. The front lawn belonged to you, but it also belonged to the street. It was private space made visually public, a green contribution to the shared aesthetic of the neighborhood that happened to sit on your deed. The result is 2 countries with completely different outdoor spaces attached to their homes. A British garden is private in a way that American outdoor space rarely achieves. The rear garden of a British terrace is enclosed on 3 sides. Nobody can see into it from the street. Nobody can see into it from neighboring houses unless they are very tall or very determined. It is a room without a ceiling, small often, but genuinely private in a way that the open American front yard with its mandatory setback and its prohibition on fencing never quite is. The British have traded space for enclosure. The American has traded enclosure for space. Both have got exactly what their housing systems were designed to produce. Neither arrangement is the obviously correct one. The small British rear garden, tended carefully and planted with more variety per square meter than perhaps anywhere else on Earth, because the British have always applied horticultural ambition to whatever space they have, does what outdoor space is supposed to do. It provides fresh air and a connection to seasons, and somewhere to sit on a warm evening. The large American yard does more of some of those things and less of others. It is hard to tend alone. It demands a mower and time and water in quantities that smaller spaces do not. It offers freedom of movement and the particular pleasure of distance from your house that a small garden cannot replicate. But the gap between them is not a gap in aspiration, it is a gap in decisions. A medieval surveyor allocating narrow burgage plots, a Victorian builder squeezing terraces onto industrial land, a 1947 Planning Act drawing green lines around every British city, a 1926 Supreme Court case permitting minimum lot sizes, a 1944 bill putting federal money behind the suburban dream, a 1956 Highway Act opening the agricultural hinterland to development. Every small British garden and every large American yard is the end result of that same long chain of decisions. Made by people who were not thinking about where a family might sit on a summer evening. Made for entirely different reasons. Producing entirely different places to go when you want to be outside and at home at the same time. In the end, every garden gate opens onto a different idea of what outdoor space is for. How much of it we call enough still reflects what our society's decided to value, and when, and whether anyone has thought to question it since.